About a year ago, my brother Jake and I decided to go on a backpacking trip. We decided to go to a mountainous region. It offered endless trails for all skill levels, but we chose one of the more remote routes. It was a 3-day, full-on wilderness experience, completely cut off from any civilization. We started early on a Friday morning, our packs loaded with everything we'd need for the weekend. The trailhead parking lot held only 2 other vehicles, confirming our choice of an off-the-beaten-path adventure. The trail proved more challenging than expected, and we often had to stop just to catch our breath. I wouldn't describe either of us as athletic, but we weren't obese either. By late afternoon, we reached our planned camping spot, a small clearing surrounded by towering evergreens. A creek ran along one edge, which solved our problem of having to find a water source. We set up our one-man tents opposite each other, creating a comfortable base camp for the night. As darkness approached, Jake built a fire, and I prepared our dinner. The forest around us was filled with the usual nighttime sounds, and the experience was unfolding just as we had hoped for. Around 10 o'clock, I briefly stepped away to go to the bathroom. When I returned, Jake told me he had heard something unusual. It sounded like footsteps, but it was from the opposite site as I had walked away from. We listened carefully, but heard nothing that wasn't normal. I told him that it might have been a deer, which was common in this area. Jake accepted the explanation, and after another 30 minutes of sitting by the fire, we eventually retired to our tents and called it a night. The next morning, we packed up and set off early, eager to cover significant ground before the sun got too hot. The route climbed steadily through spectacular alpine scenery, offering occasional glimpses of distant peaks through breaks in the forest. Several hours into our hike, we discovered a side trail marked only by a small, weathered sign. It led to what the faded text described as Hidden Lake. Jake's eyes lit up at the possibility of finding a secluded swimming spot. After 45 minutes of steady climbing, we emerged at the edge of a mountain lake. The water reflected surrounding peaks like a perfect mirror, and we immediately agreed that it had been worth the hike. We spent most of the day at the lake, swimming in the cold water and lounging on warm surrounding rocks. Eventually, hunger and the position of the sun reminded us we needed to return to the main trail and find our second night's campsite. The hike back to the main trail passed without incident, though I noticed Jake seemed unusually quiet. When I asked if everything was all right, he mentioned feeling like we were being watched while at the lake. He couldn't pinpoint the source of his unease, just a persistent sense of unseen eyes tracking our movements. We found our designated camping area fairly quickly. The setup routine went smoothly, and soon we had another fire crackling in the gathering dusk. Just after sunset, Jake said he was going to take a short walk to stretch out his legs and explore the immediate area. I continued tending the fire and organizing gear for the following day's final push back to the trailhead. 20 minutes passed, then another 30. Jake's walks typically lasted no more than 15 minutes, especially in unfamiliar terrain. After 45 minutes, I stood up and called his name several times out into the woods, but I got no response. The forest seemed dead silent. Concerned that he might have fallen, I grabbed my headlamp and set off in the direction Jake had taken. I followed the trail carefully, calling Jake's name after every few steps without getting any response whatsoever. After 10 minutes of going down the trail, I heard rustling ahead and saw the beam of a flashlight moving through the trees. Relief flooded through me as I called out, assuming Jake was making his way back. But instead of his familiar voice responding, the light suddenly went dark, and the rustling stopped completely. An uncomfortable silence settled over the forest. I stood motionless, straining to hear any sound that might indicate Jake's location. My own breathing seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. After several minutes of waiting, I decided to return to camp and see if Jake had circled back through a different route. The campsite remained empty when I arrived. Our fire had burned down to glowing coals, casting barely enough light to illuminate the immediate area. I built it back up and settled in to wait, checking my watch every few minutes as anxiety built in my chest. Nearly another hour had passed when I finally heard footsteps approaching through the trees. I turned around, fully expecting to see Jake return with an interesting story, but that wasn't what I saw. A figure emerged at the edge of the firelight. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing what appeared to be hiking clothes, but I couldn't quite make out his face in the darkness. The stranger stood at the edge of our campsite without speaking, simply staring in my direction in the flickering light of the fire. When I called out asking who he was, he didn't respond. Instead, he took several slow steps closer to the fire. As the light revealed more detail, I felt ice run through my veins. The man's face held a diabolical smile that never wavered, stretched too wide, and just looked somehow wrong. Without warning, the man turned and walked back into the darkness as silently as he'd appeared. I grabbed a burning branch from the fire and tried to follow him, but I immediately lost him in the darkness. I returned back to the fire when Jake came crashing through the underbrush just minutes later, his face pale with fear and exhaustion. He told me he'd gotten disoriented during his walk and spent the better part of an hour trying to navigate back to camp. During his struggle to find the campsite, he'd encountered an individual, which we figured was the same person I had just seen at the campsite. According to Jake, the person had simply appeared on the trail ahead of him, blocking his path with the same disturbing smile. When Jake tried to ask for directions, the figure had remained completely silent, slowly moving closer toward him. When he got too close, Jake managed to push past and ran, and hid in the forest for a couple of minutes, before trying to find his way back. We broke camp immediately and used our headlamps to navigate the trail in complete darkness. The hike back to the parking lot in the darkness was a risky task, but luckily we never came across the man again. Eventually we made it back to the trailhead, where we got in the car and drove off without hesitation. I have no idea what it was that man wanted from us that night, or what he had planned to do. My best guess is that he was some mentally ill person. His unwavering smile has left both of us deeply disturbed, and we have never gone back to that area again. I needed to get away from everything, so I booked the first out in the sticks rental I could find online. It was a small mountain cabin nestled deep in the woods, about 10 miles from the nearest town, if you could even call it that. Once I arrived at the place, the first thing I noticed was that the cabin was smaller and more weathered than it showed on the photos. But that didn't really bother me. They didn't lie about the isolation, which in the end was what I came here for. I carried my bags inside and took a look around. The cabin was sparse, with a small kitchen, a living area dominated by a stone fireplace, and a single bedroom. The wooden floors creaked with every step, and the walls seemed to absorb sound in an unsettling way. Once it started to get dark, I lit a fire in the fireplace, opened a bottle of wine, and spent a few hours on the couch before going to bed. The second day passed uneventfully. I read, napped, and took long walks through the surrounding woods. The sense of solitude was intoxicating after months of city noise and constant stimulation. I began to understand why people choose to live in places like this, completely disconnected from the outside world. On the third night, I was sitting by the fire, reading another of my books I'd brought along, when I heard something that made me look up. It sounded like footsteps on the cabin's wooden porch. I set down my book and listened carefully, but couldn't hear anything else. I convinced myself it had been a branch falling and some other noise I had picked up the wrong way. But an hour later, the sound came again. This time, it was unmistakably footsteps. My heart began racing as I realized someone was outside the cabin. I quietly moved to the front window and peered through a gap in the curtains. The porch was empty, illuminated only by pale moonlight filtering through the trees. I could see the entire length of the wooden platform, and there was no one there. But the footsteps had been so clear, I hadn't imagined it this time. I spent the next few minutes sitting in tense silence, listening for any additional sounds, but again, nothing ever came of it. Around midnight, I decided to man up and check the perimeter of the cabin. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto the porch, sweeping the beam across the surrounding forest. The light revealed nothing unusual, just trees and undergrowth stretching into darkness. But just as I turned around to go inside, in a weathered countryside accent, somebody called out, "I've been watching you." I turned around instantly and tried to see who had spoken, but my flashlight caught nothing. I called out, asking who was there and to show themselves, but the forest remained dead silent. I rushed back into the cabin and locked the door, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the deadbolt. Somebody was out there, and I didn't know what he wanted. I pulled out my cell phone, hoping to call for help, but of course, there was no signal. The nearest town was far away, and the roads I took to get here would be too dangerous to drive on in the dark. As I stood in the living room, trying to decide what to do, I heard the footsteps again on the front porch. I backed away from the door and grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace and went to the window, but again, there was nothing to be seen. Minutes passed without any additional noise. I remained frozen in place, weapon in hand, straining to hear any indication of where the intruder might have gone. The old cabin's walls suddenly felt paper thin, offering no real protection from whatever was lurking outside. Then I heard scratching at one of the bedroom windows. It sounded like someone was dragging a small rock or their fingernails across the glass. I crept toward the bedroom, flashlight in one hand and poker in the other. When I reached the bedroom doorway, I could see a shadow moving outside the window. The figure was large and seemed to be examining the window frame, looking for weaknesses or potential entry points. I held my breath, afraid that any movement would alert them to my presence. The shadow suddenly stopped moving. For a long moment, everything was perfectly still. Then, slowly, a face appeared at the window, pressed against the glass and peering into the dark room. Even in the dim light, I could see eyes scanning the interior. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in my panic. The crash echoed through the cabin, and the face at the window immediately turned toward the sound. For a terrifying moment, we stared at each other through the glass. Without thinking, I ran for the front door, unlocked it, and sprinted toward my car. I could hear movement behind me as I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine turned over just as a figure appeared at the edge of the porch light. I floored the accelerator, sending gravel flying as I raced down the dark mountain road. In my rearview mirror, I could see the cabin shrinking behind me, but I didn't slow down until I reached the main highway hours later. The next day I contacted the owner of the cabin and explained the whole situation. When they got to the place, the whole cabin had been cleaned out. My belongings were gone, as well as anything else of value, which admittedly couldn't have been all that much. Luckily, they had good insurance and were able to cover their costs. I'm just glad that I made the decision to make a run for it, instead of sticking around to find out what might have happened. My former college friend, I'll call him JJ, had been texting me for weeks, insisting I come visit his new place. We'd been best friends during our 4 years together at university, but after graduation, life pulled us in different directions. We lived about 2 hours apart. I was staying in the city, whereas he settled out in the countryside. JJ wanted to reconnect and told me he had bought a new place and that I had to come by and check it out. After much consideration and pleading with my wife, I managed to organize a getaway weekend to go out and visit him. As I drove out of the city and started getting closer to his address, I couldn't help but notice how the area kept getting shadier. It's not like I'm a high earner, but it seemed like the standards were definitely lower out here. JJ's house sat alone on a dead-end road, surrounded by overgrown fields. It was an older 2-story house with peeling paint and smudged-up windows. The level of isolation was crazy. There were no neighboring houses visible in any direction. When JJ opened the door, the first thing I noticed was how much he'd changed over the years. The energetic, quick-witted guy I remembered from college had been replaced by someone who looked rather come-down. He invited me in and gave me a tour of the house. The place had an odd smell to it, as if windows hadn't been opened in months. As we sat down in his living room and opened a can of beer, I started asking him things about his work, our mutual friends, and anything we just talked about back in the day. But JJ seemed, I don't know how to describe it, just different. His responses came slowly, often after long pauses, and he sort of stared past me rather than looking me in the eyes. When I asked about his job, or how he was adjusting to small-town life, he deflected with vague answers that revealed nothing. It almost didn't seem like the same person anymore, and I was beginning to wonder if it had been a mistake coming here. As evening approached, I suggested we go grab dinner somewhere in town, because I honestly didn't feel too comfortable in that house, but JJ declined and said he'd already prepared something for us to eat at home. JJ had prepared some toasted sandwiches, but he barely touched his own food, and instead watched me eat with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Our conversation sort of dragged along, with long moments of silence between topics. I kept checking my phone repeatedly, hoping for some excuse to cut the visit short. At some stage, I told JJ that I was tired and thought about heading home early the next morning. He looked up at me. He insisted I stay for the entire weekend as planned, reminding me how far I'd driven and how long it had been since we'd spent time together. I agreed to stay the night, but maintained that I'd probably leave after breakfast. JJ showed me to the guest room upstairs, a simple single bedroom that was just clean enough for me to be comfortable sleeping in. I said goodnight to JJ and closed the door. I sat on the bed, trying to process the strange evening, but I just couldn't get over JJ's behavior. The JJ I knew had been social and outgoing, popular with the women, and someone who thrived on conversation and connection. All in all, a great guy to be around. But now, this guy seemed like a completely different person. I texted a mutual friend of ours. I told her that I was staying at his place tonight, and he seemed different to what I remembered of him. She responded within a few minutes. She told me that a couple months ago, JJ had been involved in some kind of accident and had been acting strange ever since. She didn't have any details on the accident, but told some disturbing things she had heard from other people that went to visit him. Before I could read the whole text, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. I watched the doorknob turn slightly, and I could hear JJ breathing on the other side of the door. I remained perfectly still, hoping he would think I was asleep and move on. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated, but I could hear him moving around downstairs, the old floorboards creaking with each step. I moved to the window and contemplated if I should climb out and make a run for it. The sound of footsteps returned, this time climbing the stairs slowly. I could hear JJ moving around in what I assumed was his bedroom. Then the sound of drawers opening and closing. Metal clinked against metal, and it sounded like he was getting some kind of tools ready. The sounds continued for several minutes before everything went quiet again. I decided that I was going to get out of the house immediately. Whatever JJ was planning, this wasn't the guy that I had known, and I wasn't going to be a part of it. I carefully opened the window and began climbing out, trying to be as silent as possible. As I lowered myself toward the ground, I heard my door open above me. After realizing that I wasn't there, JJ called my name, asking where I was going. I didn't respond. instead dropping the rest of the way and running toward my car parked in the driveway. I could hear him following, his footsteps quick on the stairs, and then on the front porch. He called out again, this time more aggressive. But I didn't care. I managed to get to my car in time, and drove away, and carried on straight home without stopping. I keep thinking about what JJ had been doing in the middle of the night, seemingly moving around his tools. For some reason, I believe that this so-called accident that he had left him mentally damaged, and I believe he was planning on doing something to me that night. A few weeks later, after I had processed everything, I tried to contact JJ to talk about that night, and possibly get him some help. However, it showed that his number had been disconnected. When I contacted the police and described the situation, they told me that the house is no longer occupied and up for sale. It's been about 15 months since this all happened, and neither myself nor any of our mutual friends have heard from JJ since. Regardless of what went down that night, I hope that he is doing well and getting the help he needs before he actually hurts someone